Welcome to our IPEN IPU Public Engagement Hub seminar today on institutionalisation of public engagement. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cristina Lester Madeira and I'm chair of IPEN, the International Parliament Engagement Network, which co-hosts with the IPU, the Public Engagement Hub, within which we do these seminars. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this seminar about the institutionalisation of public engagement, focusing specifically on the case of Kenya. And we've got an excellent speaker on to talk to us about this and reflect with us about this. So today's seminar, we're focusing on the idea of institutionalisation of public engagement. And that's looking really at ways in which the structures and the processes of parliaments embed the practice of public engagement. As we know, public engagement as an activity is actually quite recent, quite new for parliaments, and they're still, trying to understand how we can actually implement these ideas. But in that context of being quite new, etc., there's actually quite a few countries that have legal provision for public engagement, where the constitution expects the parliaments having public engagement. And we had, I think it was back in November, we had a really interesting seminar that started exploring some of these issues then at the time in the context of Georgia and Indonesia. And today we're going to a different continent. We're going to African continent, and focus on Kenya, and think about, okay, so you have legal provisions, expectation of public engagement, but how does the implementation of this take place? Because just because it exists, the expectation is there, it doesn't mean that it will take place. But also, does that change the dynamics of expectations? Does that change the legitimacy of different bills, for instance, or different legislation, different scrutiny in terms of whether it's linked to public engagement or not? And again, we have addressed that in these seminars in a very different case in Northern Ireland about the particular bill, the Bill of Rights, that had, again, that legal provision expectation of public engagement. So we'll reflect on these issues with our amazing speaker coming in all the way from Kenya, Dr. Brenda Ogembo, who is actually a researcher herself and has done a PhD here in the UK, Bergen University, and has explored these issues of participatory processes with parliaments, and is a scholar herself. But Brenda is here today through her parliamentary staff role, because Brenda is actually a principal clerk assistant and the deputy head of the Senate Liaison Office at the Parliament of Kenya. And so what we thought would be interesting would be for Brenda to bring her perspective and reflections on parliamentary practice and how parliaments can deal with this idea of institutionalising public engagement. So Brenda will speak for about 10-15 minutes, I think, and then I'll ask a few questions just to follow on that. And then at about past, we'll open up for your questions or reflections that you may have from your own parliaments or your own research or whatever it may be. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Brenda now, and then I'll come back and have a few questions, if that's okay. Over to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for the invitation to speak today, and thank you to the IPU for the invitation. This is a subject that is very close to my heart, as you rightly mentioned. It's what I engage in for my PhD research, but it's also something that I have done as a practitioner. I've served in committees, carried out public participation, and continue to engage with it on a day-to-day basis in my work, working both with civil society, but also engaging with committee clerks and trying to strengthen public participation within the Senate. So my presentation today, I will be a conversation really, and I'll be highlighting just briefly the legal provisions, because some people may not know them, the legal provisions that allow for public participation in the Kenya Parliament, the standing orders that facilitate this, and then discussing more pragmatically how we actually implement public participation and some of the challenges that we have faced, and drawing from that some of the lessons that other parliaments may want to consider, or some of the other things that Parliament continues to grapple with, and probably those who are trying to implement public participation in their parliaments will grapple with or are already grappling with. And so, yeah, I will start, and then we can have a discussion at the end, or Christina can highlight the questions, and we can get a conversation going.
That's great, Brenda. So just a reminder, Brenda, to speak slowly because of our interpreters.
Slowly, yeah. Thank you, Christina, for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have translated.
Yeah.
I will work to speak slowly so that they can interpret. So for those of you, thank you. For those of you who know, Kenya passed a new constitution in 2010. And in that constitution, some of the history around it had been that people felt that they were not sufficiently engaged in decisions affecting their lives, major policy decisions. And so our constitution is very heavy on emphasizing the importance of facilitating public engagement in decision-making at the national level and at the devolved level. And we have several articles in our constitution that speak to this. We have Article 10, we have Article 174C, Article 184(1)C, Article 196, and Article 118. And I will not highlight all of them except the one that perhaps speaks to Parliament, and that's Article 118, which says that Parliament shall conduct its business in an open manner, and its sittings and those of its committees shall be open to the public and facilitate public participation and involvement in the legislative and other business of Parliament and its committees. So the article is very clear about the mandate from Parliament, and it says that Parliament shall, it's mandatory. And this has actually been a big discussion lately in Kenya about where the Constitution says shall and places a mandatory requirement on an agency or a body or on people. And accordingly, so interpreting this, the parliamentary standing orders, and the standing orders both at the national level, that's for the National Assembly and the Senate, and today I'll be mainly referring to the Senate because that's where I work, but you find these provisions also at the subnational level where we have our county assemblies that provide for public participation. And the standing order of the Senate, Standing Order 145.5, provides that a committee to which a bill is committed shall facilitate public participation and shall take into account the views and recommendations of the public when the committee makes its report to the Senate. And so the standing orders try to expound further the provision that has been provided by the Constitution. It tries to articulate and say how the Senate is going to engage on the matter of public participation to ensure that people are able to engage. Now, primarily, we have found that the engagement that people have done have been around legislation. It's been around bills. We do have public participation on petitions, but the main area in which we find public participation taking place, and which was always a controversy, was the passing of legislation. And so you find that both houses of parliament have traditionally taken, public participation as engaging primarily around the issue of passing legislation. And not necessarily really on the other processes or the other discussions or the other meetings of the House. It's primarily been around the issue of passing legislation. And then we have additional rules that also facilitate this, which are around access to Parliament. And so we have rules that provide for ensuring that committees of Parliament are open to the public, and the public are able to access any sitting of Parliament or plenary sittings of the House. However, they do not contribute unless they're attending public participation, and they're invited to do so by the chair or by the speaker. And the chairperson of a committee can choose to have a public hearing, or can choose to have a hearing, not a public hearing, can choose to have any of its committee proceedings in camera, but must provide reasons to the Senate of why they have chosen to do so. So one of the things that you can see is that Parliament has intentionally tried to make itself very open to the issue of public participation, to try and ensure that they're in an environment where people feel that they're able to engage freely. So how does this work in practice? If we're considering a bill in the House, the committee that is considering that bill, once it's assigned to it after the first reading, usually puts out an advertisement in the newspapers saying that there is public hearing to be carried out on this specific bill, and they invite written memoranda, and this is one of the things that I will be highlighting. They would invite citizens to come in and give public submissions at a public hearing that they will have on the bill to discuss the bill. Increasingly, what we have seen is that citizens either do not attend public hearings, so we see a lot of apathy, and some of the things I'll be highlighting about the challenges. And so we're increasingly seeing a trend where committees will actually just ask for written memoranda, and we'll discuss why that is a problem. And so they no longer hold public hearings as we did at the very start of the Senate, because the Senate is only in its third cycle, if you will, because the Senate was only established in the 2010 Constitution. We are now beginning to see what is different from what happened in the first and second iterations of the Senate, where they would hold public hearings that were open to any member of the public. They would literally give a date and a time when the members of the committee would be sitting there with their secretariat, and they would receive public submissions on the bill. We're increasingly just seeing situations where they ask the public to submit written memoranda. And I will discuss that shortly. So once the public come in, they will give their views to the committee chair, to the members of the committee who are present at that sitting. They could have written memoranda, they could have oral submissions, but essentially they're supposed to speak to the issues in the bill. And we have the secretariat of the committee who capture those submissions and are supposed to track the submissions and give reasons as to why they've accepted some submissions or not accepted them, as is required by the standing orders. And this would form part of the annexes of the committee report about the public submissions or the public submissions on the bill that is being considered and what the committee has chosen to take on board and what constitutes its final report. And that would then be tabled in the House. And I will come back to that shortly in terms of the public hearings and what we have learned from that and the challenges that we face. The other thing that I want to highlight briefly is what we call Senate machinani. This is where the Senate, the entire Senate, it's
Sorry, Brenda, what did you say? What you call Senate?
Senate machinani, which means Senate locally or Senate in the local. Yeah. So it goes
Thank you.
And it will identify a county. So it goes to a different part of the country, a county. Kenya has 47 counties, and it will go and sit in the local assembly of one of those counties and carry out its sittings in that county for the week. It's business, whether it's the plenary or the committee sittings. And this is actually provided for in the law, where any House of Parliament can choose to hold its sittings in any part of the country. And this has been a very powerful way in which the Senate has been able to engage in the issue of public participation by allowing people who traditionally would find it very difficult to come to the capital, to engage with Parliament, to be able to meet with legislators, to be able to ventilate on issues that affect them, particularly from the local areas where they come, and allow senators to engage with people in those local areas. And it has been a very, very popular program. And it happens once a year in September, where the Senate goes to a county and has its sittings there. And last year, we even had, because we recently had ministers come back to Parliament, ministers will travel from the capital to come to the county to address the questions that they're being asked within that, where the Senate is sitting in that local county. And for some of these places, they've never even had a minister, come to their county for certain, dockets and come and speak to them or have them within their county and see them answering questions and be able to engage with them. So it's been a very powerful way of bringing people very close to Parliament. So in principle, this looks like a very good thing. Public participation sounds good. It sounds like something that everybody should do. It's a way of ensuring that people are able to ventilate and engage with decision making. However, let's discuss the reality about how this works and the challenges that come with implementing it. The first is that it's a very costly process. And I think this comes up whether you're speaking about deliberation or any kind of engagement. Engaging the public is extremely expensive. And especially when you engage the public and you hold a public hearing, but nobody shows up. And so that is where we have begun to have this kind of slide or this kind of shift where Parliament is asking for memorandums rather than hiring a hall or hosting a sitting because you're expecting a big meeting and nobody shows up and you still have to pay for that hall. And yet nobody shows up. And so we've had a slide towards having people just submit memoranda. The second challenge that we have had is generally, and this is on Parliament, and I will speak to this, we don't have a lot of people coming. And so we have a lot of public apathy or people who are unable to engage with the bills that have been put out there. And so you have the committee clerks beginning to have what is called, they call it targeted public participation, where they reach out to organized civil society groups or organized groupings of people who they know are interested in an issue to come and ventilate or make their submissions on the issue. So what you have is the usual suspects that would engage anyway, being given an even greater platform or an even greater inroads, if you will, to come and engage with the members of the committee or to engage with the secretariat to be able to ventilate their views. And often these views are based on the issues that they are canvassing as civil society or as organized groupings. And so the voices of local people, as we like to call them in Kenya, the voice of Wanjiko, the ordinary person, often gets drowned out by these organized groups. And that continues to be a problem. The third challenge that we continue to face is we find that people are not always engaged or understand the issues that are being canvassed. So they will come for public participation on a specific issue, but then begin to ventilate on matters that do not concern that bill or the House is not able to engage on or within the the mandate or the remit of the executive. And it's not something that Parliament can do, or sometimes it's about personal challenges that they're facing, particularly when you have this happens a lot at the subnational level, but sometimes even at the national level. You find that people are primarily discussing things about personal challenges that they face, and the opportunity to be front-facing with members gives them an opportunity to ventilate on those issues. But then the challenge then lies in also with Parliament, in that we've recently had a court ruling, and so I think this is appropriate, this session has come at such an appropriate time. Last Friday, we had a court ruling that spoke to some of these challenges. And the first challenge that the court highlighted was on the health bills that have been thrown out by the court effectively. And we've had significant court rulings on public participation and what meaningful public participation is in Parliament, is that Parliament has a duty to sensitize and create awareness on legislation before citizens engage. And it expects that Parliament should do this. Now, that is a very good provision, but the question that Parliament is currently grappling with, we don't even have budgets to carry out public participation. How will we do it if you expect us to create sensitization, create awareness, provide information in ways that people are able to understand it, because Parliament says that the information is provided in a way that it is not accessible, especially considering that a number of people in this country, a significant proportion of people in this country are still illiterate. How do we make this information accessible? Considering that Parliament has about 30 days from when a bill is committed to committee to consider it. So you have resource constraints and you have timeline constraints that Parliament then has to contend with. But the court has ruled and said that this is what counts as meaningful public participation. The other challenge that we've been grappling with, and I know that this is something that's been considered, is there is no, how does Parliament provide reasons for why it did not take into account public views? And it raises the questions of, are politicians delegates or are they trustees? Do they have to take on board the views of people? If there's significant number of people pushing for an amendment, are they then duty bound to take it on board? And this raises the question about politicians having access to information sometimes that citizens do not have access to. And they make decisions with a broader access to information than sometimes citizens have, particularly in the kind of setup that we have, where it's not really deliberative, where you have a back and forth and a questioning and perhaps ministers there to answer some of the questions that citizens may have. So they have to provide reasons why they've made the decisions that they have made. And this is increasingly, we also saw this slide off where they would have in the matrix that I talked about earlier, there was no reason provided. And you know, I can say this, maybe some of my colleagues may contradict me. Some of the reasons why decisions are not taken on board were reasons such as we just don't think that recommendation makes sense. But you know, you can't really write that when you're talking to citizens or somebody putting out a document that citizens will see. And other times it's, you know, it's not in the interest of the political class perhaps to make that decision, but that is not a good enough reason. And so it raises the questions of, are politicians delegates or trustees? And increasingly we're seeing, especially in some of the bills that we have had, that where citizens feel very passionately about something, they expect that politicians will be delegates and will do what they tell them to do. And so I think where you have public participation written in law, this is something that you really do need to contend with by allowing people that kind of access. The other thing that I want to raise is the rules of practice and procedure in Parliament do not allow for citizens to engage, usually in ways that they find comfortable. The language is inaccessible to them, the procedures are intimidating, often they're exclusionary and very elitist. And so you find that the people who either do not want to come to Parliament, or when they do not feel that they're capable of ventilating or expressing themselves in ways that they're comfortable with, or in languages that they're comfortable with. And the court has actually ruled in a country like ours, where people speak so many different languages, that information needs to be made available and accessible in a language that people understand. And that means translating into local languages. Again, another resource issue. But also, how do we change rules of procedure to allow people to feel comfortable to engage? I think recently on our finance bill, we've seen that X space has become a space where young people feel very comfortable engaging because they're able to speak in a way that they're comfortable with, in a language that they're familiar with, and they don't have to engage in a formalistic way that often restricts how they want to engage. And I think particularly thinking about young people, the rules and regulations or rules and procedures of Parliament are something that they often find significantly exclusionary and constraining. And that comes as well to the institutional architecture of Parliament and how parliamentary sittings are designed, particularly committees. In our case in Kenya, for example, it's very much designed as an information, citizens telling politicians and telling members of Parliament and not necessarily engaging in a conversation. And again, this is often very exclusionary and people choose not to engage or they don't feel that they're going to be heard. And this is something that people really do need to contend with when they're thinking about implementing public participation and the issue of meaningful deliberation. And I am coming to the end. I can see that we have a few minutes, Christina. And the last thing, one of the last things that I want to mention is, I think, and one of the things that is emerging for us in Parliament is that it's very important to set intentions and expectations from the very beginning. What should citizens expect from public participation? What should they expect as the outcome? People need to be very clear about what it is that they can change and what it is that the legislature is able to do. I don't think we have also been very good with doing this, but I think particularly perhaps in some of the more recent legislation that we're seeing in Parliament, this is becoming an issue. That people perhaps expect that they have more power than they actually do. But I think Parliament also needs to reflect about what power do they want to give. Are the guidelines clear? So Kenya has never enacted a legislation on public participation. We've had several attempts. I think we have had about 4 public participation bills we brought to the House over the last 2 terms. I think there's even one in the House at the moment, but it's never been passed. And it's taken different forms from, trying to think about what the rules are, how public participation should be conducted, where it should be conducted. But, the legislation has actually never taken form. So is this something that would be helpful? Creating the rules of public participation together with citizens is perhaps something else that Parliament needs to consider. The role of facilitators. Often public participation is facilitated by parliamentary staff who are not trained or equipped to be facilitators. They're non-partisan staff to run committee sittings, but they're put in this position where they need to facilitate public participation. Should parliaments be establishing departments to run public participation? Who is going to translate these documents? Who is going to create sensitization and awareness? Who is going to ensure that within these public participation spaces, there's equality of power and people actually able to engage in a way that is meaningful? Is this something that they need to consider, or do we need to be building the capacity of parliamentary staff to be able to do this? And changing the role of committee clerks, so adding staff to committee secretariats that actually have this role that they're supposed to do and facilitate meaningful engagement, particularly as we see court rulings that are pushing for more meaningful engagement from Parliament and are willing to strike down legislation due to lack of meaningful engagement. And lastly, is about teaching citizens about engagement and ensuring that citizens have the capacity and building their capacity to be able to engage in ways that ensure that they understand the language, they understand the expectations of politicians, and they don't come in ways that lead, what's the word? I'm trying to be politically correct, that lead people to dismiss what it is that they're contributing. Because oftentimes we see that when they're not engaged with the issues or they're not able to articulate the concerns in the way that other policymakers or organized groups are able to do, that concerns of ordinary people get shoved to the bottom or are not taken as seriously. And so perhaps we need to build the capacity of citizens to engage in the language and to be able to understand the language that is used in Parliament. Perhaps this is something else that we need to do to strengthen their ability to engage and ensure greater inclusivity. I think those are the highlights of what I wanted to bring, Christina. Perhaps we could engage, you could clarify, and maybe there are things that I've missed that I could clarify. But I tried to point out how we implement it and some of the challenges we've seen emerge. Or one last thing before I leave, we have developed online platforms where citizens are able to submit their views online. That has not worked. It has not worked, especially in a country like Kenya, where not everybody has access to the internet. Again, literacy concerns, again, understanding. We usually find that we get very limited views, and again, from the usual suspect. And so we've had bill annotation platforms supposed to submit views, and these have not taken off, and increasingly have just been dropped from the platform because they've not been very useful, because I know that is one of the things that has always been proposed to Parliament as one way of doing public participation, but it has not been very effective. Thank you.
That's been so interesting, Brenda. I've got so many notes, and it speaks to so many things that we've covered before in the seminars, but also to some of my recent research where I've looked at barriers to engagement and how the idea that to go beyond the usual suspects, you really need to invest in terms of the way you communicate, the information you give, a sort of that idea of scaffolding participation. Just because participation is there, it does not mean that people will come and participate. They need to understand the language, they need to understand the processes and all of those things. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from lots of people, and I've got lots of questions, but I won't abuse my power as chair, I promise. And I'll just ask a question for clarification, and then a slightly more a different type of question. But for clarification, because as you're explaining about what all the expectations you have and all the systems you have for people to participate, I was wondering, does the Parliament of Kenya have, what's the education provision? Do you have any education provision, services that dedicate themselves just to educate the people? So I'm seeing this call, for instance, we've got Conor O'Neill from Ireland. His whole role is within education. Joseph in Salzburg is in that area also, with also things like youth parliaments. And connected to that, because I always think that that's linked to the education system in the country. Is there like citizenship education? Is there anyone that's thinking, by the way, look at Parliament? So can you just give a little bit of an outline? How is the provision within Parliament in terms of education, and does that link to the system in the country? And if you can keep both spotlights like that for now, please, that would be great. Thank you, Brenda.
That's a very interesting question. So we don't necessarily have an education provision within Parliament. We have the Sergeant-at-Arms Department and the Protocol Department that are tasked with ensuring that when people visit Parliament, they educate them on how Parliament works. We have a student visit program to Parliament, where students from schools are able to apply and come to Parliament to try and understand how it works. And this falls within a subject of the study called social studies. It's taken many different names over the years, but effectively it's about how government is structured and how Parliament works. And so usually when they do that unit, you have schools, and not all schools, some schools apply to come to Parliament and have a chance to engage, see how the sittings are done. They don't really go to committees. What they usually do is they'll sit in plenary, they'll have a chance to walk around Parliament, and the Protocol and Sergeant-at-Arms Department will take them through. We haven't developed learning materials. I know that this has been a discussion for a very long time. There are no written learning materials for them. And the way it's produced is not student-friendly. It's not young people-friendly. It's very much targeted at older people. And so the discussion is very much geared at those who actually make the application to come to Parliament and what they then learn in school for those who are in social studies. And a lot of the time, people who come are from public schools. We don't really have children who come from private schools as well, which is, can open up a whole can of worms about what that means and why, they choose not to engage, and how that then affects engagement in the future based on who goes to private schools and who goes to public schools. But I will not get into that discussion, but that's how it works. We don't really have an education function. It's run by the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Protocol Department and they facilitate it on request from my office when we have visiting delegations.
And it sounds like it's structured around visits to the institution rather from an education perspective. That's really interesting. And my slightly provocative question, it's not really provocative, but it's sort of to try to step away a little bit from this, is if you had a magic wand and you could set up the Parliament to do real public engagement with the people, I'm giving you all the power now, what would you do? What would you change, and how would it work?
Oh gosh, that's such an interesting question, and something that I've really thought about and I think would be fantastic if Parliament had sortition chambers or upstanding permanent citizens' assembly. I really think that would be a powerful way of not only determining committee agendas, but of ensuring that there are people there to ensure that the citizen voice is brought in, and the design of participation actually allows for citizen voices who are not politically beholden, who represent ordinary people. And I'll go more the direction of a sortition chamber that is rotational, or a permanent citizens' assembly that sits for a session of Parliament and is then changed. So I think deliberation and sortition chambers may really be something that Parliament needs to consider, because they would bring in the random selection of citizens that would happen, would really moderate the kind of political interest or bring in the voices of the people who are not able to engage, because you have a cross-section representation of society. I know we always say that politicians are representative of society, and in many ways, yes, they are, but they're also moderated by their political interests, by elections, by campaigns, by being decampaigned. And I think a citizens' assembly is something that would really work, particularly at the subnational level. I know we have some subnational assemblies that have been playing around with it, trying to have youth parliaments, that's it. But having it in law, having it in practice, I think is something that would be really powerful. And how popular it would be, I'm not sure with our elected leaders. I've not gained much traction with that conversation, but if I had a magic wand, I definitely think it is something that Parliament should try and pilot to ensure that we can bring in voices from a cross-section of people who can really speak to the issues that citizens are facing, even if they're not able to come from all parts of the country, and they would be in tune with what is happening, what is being said on the ground, and communicating it in ways that legislators can understand and have a voting voice as well.
Thank you. I mean, that raised lots of other questions in my head, but I'm not going to dominate the discussion, and I'm going to open up a little for other people's questions. If you like to ask a question, can you please click on raise your hand, which I think is accessed at the bottom by reactions. You can click on that and ask your question, or you can put in the chat and I'll read your question, and that's absolutely fine. And we already have a great question actually from Andy Richardson. So I'll read that question now if that's okay. But in the meanwhile, please do raise your hand to ask questions to Brenda or put them in the chat. Or if you don't, I'll just dominate and ask my own questions. So the question from Andy, Brenda, is how do you assist senators in this process of public engagement? It's a really important question. And it says, do you provide some form of training or support? What would senators need to help make the public participation process work?
That's a very good question. Yeah. The way the public participation is designed, I actually feel that the main person who runs this is the staff. Members show up to listen. There's no training on public participation. I think I just say that outright. There's no training either for staff or for members of public participation, which I do think is a failure on the part of Parliament. And I think increasingly as the court rules and demands more meaningful public participation, they will realize that this is something that they need to take more seriously, but there's no training. And the staff, particularly, who engage, who write up the reports, who facilitate the hearings, have no training either, and they're the ones who facilitate members. So the chair, the public participation hearing runs like any other hearing of the committee. The chair is in charge. He directs who answers the question. He invites the people to ask the questions. He determines who gets to speak, who gets to have follow-up questions, and which of his members gets to speak in that public hearing. And what the committee clerks do is provide advice to the committee members, perhaps answering questions that they want to clarify, or providing further information that they want to interrogate. And so they support the members in their representative role, in their lawmaking role, but there's no specific support for public participation or to prepare members to engage in public participation. And that is a problem. That is a problem that I think is definitely one of the things that needs to be acknowledged. Yeah. But it comes down again to the question of resources. Parliament, we have restrained budgets. The budgets for public participation are really not there. It's part of the budget. They don't have any special budget for public participation. And so it's a bare bones exercise, really, to just ensure that people come in and they can say, we've had your views and we're going to take them into account. The support is in the legal staff, the secretariat, who is supposed to interpret what people have said, and in helping to determine what decisions are being taken, and in providing, the room for them to ask questions and then help them clarify or have any follow-on questions. But no, there's no specific or special support that is provided.
No. And it sort of brings back to the idea that to do public participation, public engagement, you really need the structures, the services, the resources there. It just doesn't happen just like that. And the training, there's a point made by Andy, it's a very good point. I've got another question in the chat from Joseph, which I have seen, but I'll come to Francis Owa now, and then I'll come to your question, Joseph. So Francis Owa, can you just say briefly where you're calling us from, and do ask your question?
Thank you very much, Brenda. I think this is a very insightful contribution into the growing body of discussions on this important area of the work of parliaments, not just in Kenya, but elsewhere. What I'm wondering, listening to you talk about apathy, is whether some of that apathy is actually driven by the fact that the quality of the integration of whatever it is that citizens want included in legislation, for instance, isn't at a very good level. And I think you are spot on when you say, as the courts continue to make decisions. So is there a way to make sure that both what is available, let's say on Parliament's website, and other places, gives the public a good sense, first, of what exactly it is that Parliament was told about that law, so that there can be some, external citizen audit, even by citizens who are not at that hearing, of whether Parliament has actually been faithful to the feedback that it was given. Because that, I think, for me, would be the way to reduce some of that apathy. Over.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Brenda.
So I think actually that's one of the things that the court was ruling on. The first thing is they were very clear in the ruling that came out on Friday that the information that Parliament puts out in sensitization and awareness needs to be about how the law is going to affect citizens. What is it going to do? You need to say it in a way that makes sense. They went down in ruling so far that the advertisement had wording that was too small for people to see and make sense of. It was very specific. It needs to make this as accessible, including the fact that where do you put this information? One of the things they said was that you putting this information in the newspapers and the dailies in a country where many people are illiterate and cannot read or do not have ability to buy newspapers is actually exclusionary. So how do you ensure that you get this information out to people? And this is the question that we're currently grappling with. And I think we all knew it would eventually come. But you're right, in providing, I think there's always, as I said, a disconnect of information, that citizens do not know what it is that parliamentarians know as they consider that legislation. I think this is something that needs to be considered, that citizens need to know what legislators have been told prior, and then following that, ensuring that they can then give their feedback based on what legislators have been told. And this comes to my question of citizens' assemblies, where you have citizens who have the exact same information that legislators have in this decision-making. Since we're not heading there, perhaps it's going to be a ruling of the court in future that if they're going to have targeted groups, they must make public what targeted groups have told them before, and how they've taken that on board in light of what citizens are saying. Increasingly, they have told us that they will be giving very clear direction on why they have rejected certain citizens' views, but we will see how that will play out in the future. But I agree with Francis' sentiments. There is a disconnect of information. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Joseph's question now on which is in the chat. So I'll just read it if that's okay, Brenda. So just asks, and Joseph, just for context, is based in Austria, in a subnational legislature in Austria, in Europe. Thank you for the talk. That was very insightful. My question would be, when an incoming government plans the legislation to come, is there a chance to intervene at this pre-parliamentary stage of legislation that could facilitate public engagement later down in the process? So it's very much about, at what point is the public engaged or public participation facilitated? Is it right at the end when the bill is prepared? Is it beforehand? Because that obviously is very important in terms of considering it, isn't it?
Yeah. So public participation in Kenya, in the constitution, as I said, we have very many provisions, including the fact that government, the executive arm of government, is supposed to carry out public participation on its decisions and its policies. So oftentimes, the bill will be the result of a certain policy that has been brought into place, and public participation should have taken place. And the challenges that bedevil Parliament are the same things that you see in the executive: lack of adequate timelines, lack of provision of information in ways that people are able to digest, lack of adequate engagement in sensitization and awareness. In fact, in many ways, there's a lot of opportunity for citizens to engage that I feel that increasingly as you come further down the line, everybody feels that somebody else has done it. Somebody else has already engaged the citizens. Citizens are over-engaged. And this is something that perhaps needs to be clarified. And this is one of the areas that I think I could be wrong. It's open to debate that a legislation on public participation could clarify. What does each stage of public participation, what should each stage deal with? Yeah, because every stage of creating the law, creating the policy is always doing the same thing. They're all town halls and just allowing people to ventilate. But what are they ventilating on? What should the executive be focusing on what should the legislature be focusing on, and what do citizens need to know about each stage. So public participation is open across the board. Kenyans are able to engage significantly. It's one of the beauties of our constitution, but it seems to actually be undermining public participation. And I know Oliver Escobar, we've talked about this with him before, and he said that he doesn't think that there should be public participation on every legislation. And that is open to debate, but perhaps that is actually something that we need to consider. And you do see that happening in terms of the submission of memoranda. The clerks determine what they think is significant or has great impact, and they then have public hearings for those. And what they think has limited impact, they then ask for written memoranda. Again, something that open to debate and a Pandora's box, and eventually cost them. Yeah.
Thank you. We still have quite a few questions, and I've seen the questions in the chat from Senator Dr. Hussein and Vera Vuari. But I'll go to Temitayo Odeyemi now, and then JK Nundungu, and I'll take those two questions together if that's okay. So Temitayo first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for that fascinating presentation on Kenya. I have some sort of related questions linking to the challenges that you have highlighted in the Kenyan case, which is quite common with most developing parliaments in that sense. And the first one would be that you mentioned the challenges with coming up with a public engagement legislation. I do know that in some parliaments that don't have such legislations, they then develop strategic documents that sort of shape how engagement takes place, talks about expectations, what should happen, how resources are deployed. Is there something like that in the Kenyan case? And then a whole lot of the other challenges that you highlighted, there are things that we have seen civil society organizations come in to sort of mitigate in some context. So I wonder what sort of space exists in the Kenyan context for civil society organizations to come in and cover the gaps that you have mentioned in terms of mediating the relationship between the institution and the public. And then Kenya, as you mentioned, has more than 40 subnational parliaments alongside the national parliament, and the challenges, as highlighted, are quite similar. Is there any sort of sector-wide collaboration that sort of share practices and resources across these levels, like you have in, say, South Africa, for instance, that helps to also bolster capacity in the aspect of engagement with the public? I think then the last one, you mentioned the court's
That's
ruling.
a lot of questions, let me tell you.
The court's ruling, sorry. That's sort of the recent court ruling. So I wonder who actually initiated the court ruling, in this sense that some other contests have these challenges, but nobody is talking about addressing things from the legal perspective. Was this from the institution or civil society or individual citizens? Thank you.
Right, we have a lot of questions still to come in. So can I ask JK Ndungu to come in with their question, and then Brenda, if you can bring them together. And there's someone called Linda something that was wanted to ask a question, but she's gone now, so I don't know. But there's questions more in the chat. So yeah, brief answers, please, Brenda. No, JK Ndungu now, sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this wonderful debate. Thank you, Brenda, for a very crisp presentation, and Christina, wonderful moderation. I think, Brenda, for me, and this stems from the conversation around the court rulings, and these rulings more and more are aligned to meaningful engagement. And it's something you've touched on, I think, and I guess this is a sort of part of the suggestions to help the whole process of public participation. From your presentation, you've sort of like summarized the challenges into institutional issues, the rules and everything, and then resources, but also the thing about how do we make the debate, the conversation meaningful. And I think for me, and this is something I would sort of like to hear what you think is, as a citizen, when I come to present issues, whether it is before Parliament or County Assembly or the executive, I don't have to understand the technical language in terms of how the policy response will be like. So I think it's upon Parliament and I guess Senate, National Assembly, that when citizens bring their issues, that you harvest them in a way that you extract what you need to extract to represent the sentiments of the citizen. And I think that's a big deal in terms of are starting to define meaningful engagement. So that's the bit from Senate. But for citizen, I think the CSO need to do a better job to just break down the process, the procedures, so that citizens are aware in terms of getting prepared about the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a great question there about meaningful engagement. Brenda.
Thank you. I'll be brief because we're running out of time and I still have many questions.
Thank you.
So on public engagement legislation, there, as I say, there's no legislation at the moment. There are guidelines from the State Department of Devolution. They're very broad. And when you read the guidelines that were established, they really speak to the executive. They don't really speak to Parliament. And I think obviously it's because of the separation of powers. So the guidelines that they give do not necessarily apply to how Parliament would carry out citizen engagement. And the standing orders just provide kind of the one-liner about public participation, but there's no breakdown. And I think that's something else that parliaments should really think about. How would this work in principle? What exactly are you trying to achieve? And even some of those questions about meaningful engagement need to be designed. You have to design meaningful engagement, and Parliament must contend with this. And perhaps the standing orders should speak to this. Perhaps it should be an annex. But as the summary to your question, that there are guidelines from the State Department, no guidelines in terms of legislation or from Parliament itself. Civil society mediating the relationship. Yes, in some ways, because civil society in Kenya is very, is very robust, has been there for many years. The problem that we have with civil society is that they've formed a relationship with Parliament, where when they want to present views, Parliament will run to them to cover the public participation angle. And this works for them for their results harvesting. But are they really facilitating citizen engagement? I'm not necessarily sure that that's exactly what they're doing. They're simply covering their backs to ensure that they have results. But the problem that we have, and this is the problem with, and why I've never really encouraged this idea of using civil society or development partners to strengthen public participation. When they leave, Parliament has no capacity to carry out public participation. This needs to be a role and a mandate that's taken on and owned by Parliament. Where we have seen civil society come in some of our subnational legislatures, when they have left, public participation has collapsed because they're now not financing citizens to come. They're not providing transport services or reimbursing transport. They're not providing the summary of information that citizens need to engage. So civil society, in some ways, is a double-edged sword. It works very well when they're financing. When their financing priorities change, then you have a parliament that is left without the resources or capacity to actually be able to engage. I know we talk a lot about institutionalization, sustainability, or development programs, but the challenge remains that once you have somebody else running public participation for you, it's easier to hand that role over to them, and Parliament then fails to build its own systems. So I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of handing this over to civil society. But in Kenya, they do try to engage, particularly at the subnational level, to facilitate citizens. But we have that problem. When they leave, we see a dip in public participation. Sector-wide collaboration, yeah, we do have what is called the County Assemblies Forum, as well as the Society of Clerks at the table. And they have meetings to discuss broad things about practice, legislative practice. One of the things I've discussed is public participation and trying to improve just generally legislative practice across the subnational legislatures. But because our subnational legislatures are so new, there are so many issues that they're contending with, and public participation has not been at the top of the priority list. We have a lot of conversations about it, but again, it comes down to resources. Public participation requires resources. Our subnational legislatures are resource constrained even more than the national parliament. Who initiated the court ruling? It was done by an individual, I believe somebody who was representing the health sector interest. So often Kenya has developed a very litigious culture. It's very easy to access the courts. And so we see individuals going when they feel that Parliament has failed to address the amendments or the issues or that they had with the legislation. They go to court, and we have Parliament is ever in court. I think at any given time, there's a bill in court that Parliament is, being sued for. And so it's really citizens involved who are either in that sector or sometimes civil society groups who go to Parliament when issues have not been addressed and then initiate, then Parliament, then the courts then rule on that particular issue. On meaningful engagement, you're very right, GK, that perhaps the issue Parliament should harvest. And this comes to something that I wanted to say as a concluding statement, is that genuine will and commitment, political will and commitment is needed for public participation to succeed. You can say everything that you want to say, but without genuine political will and commitment from legislators and from staff, you will really be talking to yourself. So that is true. but at the same time, knowing the other kind of the issues that play out in Parliament. The Parliament is a political institution. We cannot ignore the fact that we need to equip citizens with the ability to be able to engage. And that's what we have seen now. Artificial intelligence technologies like ChatGPT that enable citizens to be able to digest information, and AI is actually changing the game on public participation. Give citizens the tools to be able to not only understand the legislation in ways that make sense to them, equip them with easy language to be able to capture their views, they're then able to engage in ways that actually push back to the politicians, push back to the Secretariat and what they've presented, and actually use this to contest what is being put out there. And so I think it is very powerful, and we cannot ignore and put the responsibility simply on Parliament, because there's no incentive for them to do it. And so we really have to also look at the side of citizens and ensure that they can meaningfully engage. Civil society is trying to do this, but we must also ensure that as we put out, and I guess that's exactly what the ruling was about, wasn't it? That what you put out there to citizens needs to be digestible to them. They need to be able to see the impact on their lives. They need to be able to come back in ways that make sense, and that they're able to challenge what it is that you're putting out there. So I think it's a double-edged sword. We cannot there's no incentive on the part of Parliament except political will and commitment to be able to have meaningful engagement. And so we must ensure that citizens can push back and ensure that Parliament is actually engaging them meaningfully, because they understand how this is going to affect them.
Thank you very much, Brenda. That was really good attempt of answering all those questions in a very concise way. I'm very impressed. I've got two final questions which are in the chat. So one is from Senator Dr. Hussein Mohammed Tahir from Somalia, and he just wants to know, or they just want to know, whether the bill starts from the Senate or the lower house. So hopefully that'd be a straightforward one. And then I've got a more sort of more general question, really interesting question actually, which I haven't really discussed very much today yet, from Vera Wiry, and apologies to everyone if I'm not saying your names properly. And the questions are saying, thank you also for the presentation, but also asking, are there any trends on what age or demographics mostly attend public participation in Kenya? So including gender gap and any types of social demographics that you may be aware of. And then we'll conclude.
Thank you. Thank you. So on the first question about where the bill originates, so in the Kenyan Parliament, any bill can originate from the National Assembly. The National Assembly can originate any bill that it wants to originate, but the Senate cannot originate money bills. It needs to originate bills that concern counties primarily. That is the kind of legislation that it's able to originate. So it depends on, just depend on the legislation that you're talking about. For example, public participation bill has originated from both houses because it is an issue that concerns counties. But if you're talking about, for example, the finance bill that has been in the press of late, the finance bill can only originate in the National Assembly and is only considered by the National Assembly. That is how our constitution is structured. On the second issue about trends and demographics, sadly, I must admit, the last time I looked at this and there was no concise data. We're supposed to take, Parliament's supposed to take data of those who attend public hearings, but it's not analyzed, it's not tracked, and it's always, it's not always for every bill, you don't always find it. But the last time I looked at it, I was looking at county legislation, I can speak from my practice working in committees as well, is that the people who attend public hearings tend to be older people, middle-aged to older people. We don't see a lot of young people attending public hearings, and that would make sense. When I did my research, young people are out every day trying to do work, trying to find casual work, and public hearings are held during the day, which is another thing that it needs to be considered when designing public participation. The times at which the committee sits is not conducive for many young people to come to Parliament to engage, and so you tend to find older people, retirees. I don't know if I would say that you can necessarily notice a difference between men and women, primarily probably more men, simply because, Kenya being a very patriarchal society, and a lot of civil society organizations that we see represented, the heads will tend to be men. And we have targeted groups who come to Parliament, but that is not a scientific study. But the one thing that I can definitely tell you, you do see a trend towards older people coming to engage, as well as the other interesting demographic that is there is people who consume public services, poorer people. Don't necessarily see middle class people who in a society like ours have found resources outside of the private sector to respond to all government failure, you tend not to see them coming for public engagement, which again,
interesting.
Something that it really needs to be considered because of the power that those people have to be able to influence either by their vote or by their existence. And that then plays a part in how decisions that are taken on board. That was something that I definitely picked up.
We're really running out of time, and there's two really big questions in the chat. So I'm going to try to summarize it, and can you please give me really quick questions? And Vera just said thank you for your answer, by the way. So there's a question from Buchere Breton, and one of them is about the future of public engagement, the role of social media. Big topics, quick answer, please. The other one is committee clerks as gatekeepers. How can we turn that into meaningful engagement? Thank you.
Oh yeah, two really big questions.
Yeah.
Parliaments cannot, there are two things that Parliament cannot, can no longer ignore: artificial intelligence and social media. Young people, particularly on social media, how they choose to engage, whether that is Twitter, what do you call it, TikTok, or Instagram. Putting their information there, they will not come to Parliament, and they expect Parliament to go and engage them in those spaces. We've seen the President engage on X space. Parliament must begin to have this discussion. They can't put dead links on their platforms and expect young people to give them feedback. This is something that we really do need to engage with, the social media engagement and meaningful engagement, particularly. I think people, young people particularly, in a world that is increasingly populist, where we have a cost of living crisis, recession, young people are no longer willing to be ignored. They're no longer willing to live lives that are less than their parents lived. So Parliament is going to have to engage them meaningfully and engage them where they are. And I think this is something that is a big discussion that needs to take place. Committee clerks, again, I do think that there's a danger of committee clerks becoming gatekeepers, particularly impacting final committee reports and what decisions are taken into account. A lot of trust of committee chairs, and usually committee chairs do not go back and look at every view that was submitted. That is the job of committee clerks, who then summarize and determine what is taken into account. So either mandating that they have to take into account all views and present summaries of those and why they are not taken on board, or finding ways to ensure that committee clerks are actually trained and understand that their role is not to be gatekeepers or to advise politicians or to determine what is meaningful.
Yeah, slightly different role, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Brenda. That was an amazing effort, again, to answer two really big topics. Now, before I ask you all to join me in thanking Brenda for an amazing and interesting insight into public engagement in Kenya, just to announce that our next Public Engagement Hub seminar, so cooperation between the IPU and IPEN, will be on the 17th of September, and you've got the details in the chat now, and it's going to be on the Clean Air Act in Thailand, which is actually a piece of legislation where CSOs can actually submit legislation to Parliament, and that's gone through Parliament. So it should be really interesting for all of you who are here today. So that's 17th of September. And you can find more details about the Public Engagement Hub. Hopefully someone put the link, there we are. Fiona's put the link to the Public Engagement Hub in the chat, so you can look at that if you wish. So thank you everyone for attending. We've had really, really good questions, really good participation. We had good public participation here in the seminar. And thank you for the interpreter for doing an excellent job to interpreting our words into French, or vice versa. And obviously our main thank you to Brenda Ogembo for giving us the time and her reflections in what's been a really, really fascinating seminar. And can you please all join me in applauding however you want to, and say thank you to Brenda. And that's been really, really interesting, and I hope to see you all soon. And Brenda, please don't go, so I can say thank you to you properly when everyone is left. But for everyone else, have a good day, good evening, whatever it may be, and hopefully we'll see you on the 17th of September for our next seminar.